welcome to another episode of Bushcraft Survival. Well, today we're in the UK, in East Sussex, and I'm here with my mentor and very good friend, Paul Kirtley. Thanks once again for joining us, Paul.
My pleasure, Gordon. My pleasure.
I've just finished doing a 7-day intermediate bushcraft course with Paul, and previous to that I was over here, was invited to speak at the World or Global Bushcraft Symposium held in Wales a couple of weeks ago. And we'll talk about that very soon. But Paul and I are going to have a chat about a few different things. But before we do, if Paul, I know if you've seen, we've had an interview and a talk before on a previous episode, so please check that out. But for those that haven't tuned into that, Paul, if you'd just like to just do a quick introduction about your background, and we'll go from there.
Sure, thanks Gordon. So very happy to be here and sharing some stuff on Gordon's channel. So my background is I own a bushcraft school in the UK called Frontier Bushcraft, and we do courses in the UK. We also do courses and trips in other parts of the world. And I've been teaching bushcraft professionally for 15 years now. I started as a student of bushcraft in my 20s, having been interested in all manner of outdoor activities when I was a kid. So survival skills, so Lofty Wiseman's Survival Handbook was a key thing for me when I was in my teenage years. Then I got into backpacking, and then I started going to courses at Woodlaw, which was Ray Mears' school, and I did a bunch of courses there. Then I started working there part-time, then I was working there full-time, and I've been running my own bushcraft school for the last 12 years. So I've been involved in this field for a long time, and very much enjoy sharing what I know with other people and helping them with their journeys, learning bushcraft, survival skills, outdoor skills, wilderness skills, etc., etc. So yeah, happy to chat about all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Great stuff. Okay, so I had the pleasure of talking at the Global Bushcraft Symposium a couple of weeks ago in Wales, and that's been held for the third time, I believe.
Yes, yeah. I mean, it was under the name Global Bushcraft Symposium. This was the second one, but the tradition of this coming together of people who from around the world who are instructors in bushcraft and survival goes back to a conference that Lars Falt organised in 1995 in Jukkasjärvi in northern Sweden. And Mors Kahansky was there, Mel DeWeese was there, Tom Luchtjens, Ray Mears, a number of other people were there, and that then kind of petered out in that guise after another couple of attempts to run that, one of which was in the UK, and then it was for various reasons brought back. That idea came back into this idea of the Global Bushcraft Symposium, which sort of really, the seed for that was with people like Cody London, Dave Westcott, Dave Delafield, Dave Holder, Randy Brucemer, a number of conversations that they had in North America about wouldn't it be great to have something like that again, particularly given that Mors was involved with the first one, and a lot of them have links with Mors Kahansky. So the 2019 GBS was born out of those conversations, and then we've just carried it forwards with the 2022 GBS, which was held in the UK. So.
Which you and Lisa Fenton chaired, and you're invited to put that together, which was an awful lot of work, which I can only guess how much work that was. And coming over for that, it was a fantastic event, and we'll link to that to see who the different speakers were. There were plenty of different speakers, some incredible people, and I don't want to miss anyone out by not mentioning them, so we'll link to who they were. But it was a fantastic event, and any of the names that Paul's mentioning here, they're all people you should check out, and as far as your bushcraft training and learning, they're all important people in the fields of bushcraft. We're underneath a flight path here to Gatwick Airport, so you're going to hear the occasional aircraft fly by. So if it's potted in some ways and different cuts, that's due to that. But if it's loud enough, we'll stop and restart. So be patient with us there. So Paul, you shared that with Lisa this year, and that was fantastic the way you put that together.
Thank you.
and we'll go into what was in that, but we'll link to that, and you can check out. There's more coming on the 22 Bushcraft Symposium, what's involved in that, and some of the speakers that's going to be.
Yeah, we had over 30 speakers, and we recorded most of those presentation sessions, and that will be put out as a package. It'll be a paid download package with all the slides from all the presentations edited into a professionally produced set of videos, and they'll be available to stream or download online for a relatively small fee given the amount of information that's in there. And that'll help support the GBS going forwards as well. And there's already plans for another one. I'm not organising the next one, but there's already plans for another one in 3 years' time in 2025. And so watch this space for more information on that and where that will be.
Wonderful, that'll be great. I'll certainly be there for that. And something you all should check out as well. Now, at the 2019 Symposium, which I was unable to get to, you talked about topic and talking about the Dunning-Kruger Effect and how that relates to bushcraft. I wonder if you could sort of elaborate on some of those things, and I think it's something that we all should be aware of, because in Australia at the moment, where I believe we're about 10, 12 years behind the UK and the States in many respects, and we are in Australia for many things, and that can be a good and a bad thing because it allows us to see what's happening, we can correct things, but in other areas it's not. But that's just the way it is from my observations. Of course, that's my opinion on that. Yeah, that's the way I see bushcraft growing, which is a great thing, and we're sort of coming to a new moving forward, and we're sort of catching up there, but it's great because it's all fresh and exciting, so I'm excited about that. And I think there's some sort of attitudes and ways of thinking which I think we could sort of address before we sort of get to where you are now, so that we can ensure a nice healthy development in that. So and I think one of those things is a Dunning-Kruger.
Avoiding some of those pitfalls. I was one of the keynote speakers at the 2019 GBS, and one of the things that I included in my talk, amongst other things, was a consideration of the Dunning-Kruger effect. And there's a number of different aspects to it, but a simple aspect that I think a lot of people can grasp once they think about it, and it doesn't just apply to bushcraft and survival, it applies to any area of knowledge or even actually skill. I mean, you see it in martial arts, you see it in lots of different areas. And that's about, once you have a bit of knowledge, you think you know more than you do. And so there's a number of aspects to this, because you go from being a complete beginner in a subject and being super keen about learning, and you get some easy wins. You know, you get your first techniques, your first bit of knowledge, you learn about some bush tucker, some wild edibles, you've got some basic fire techniques going, and you feel like, wow, you know, I was worried about not being able to do any of this, and now, you know, I can find some wild edibles, I can make a fire, I can boil my water, I can make a basic shelter. I've got over some of the hurdles that I feel like were huge, and now I can do these things, and that makes people feel like the top of the world, which is great. It's one of the things that's a great joy in what we do, is moving people from being afraid or worried or wary of the bush or the outdoors to being more comfortable in it. But in terms of understanding where you're at in your learning path, it can be quite distorting. That kind of euphoria of the new learner can be quite distorting, in the sense that you feel like you've made a huge leap, and in a way you have, but based on knowing very little or nothing to where you are now at that stage as a kind of progressing beginner, you've made a huge, if you wanted to put it in percentage terms, you've made a huge percentage change in your knowledge base in that subject area. And you see it the same in martial arts. People go from not doing anything, they learn some break falling techniques, they learn a few throws, maybe they learn a few, you know, stances or what have you, and they start to feel like they're a fighter, but there's a huge amount that they still haven't learned, and in terms of technique. And then there's also the consideration of experience in applying those techniques whether it's bushcraft or martial arts or anything else, in context. So applying them correctly and prioritizing things correctly. And that's part of it. That's kind of how people experience feeling like they know a lot more than they do. They don't know all the other aspects of the subject matter. They don't know all of the other techniques and all the nuances, etc. They've got a good grasp of the basics, and they feel like they're on top of the world with their knowledge base in that area. But the problem is then not knowing what you don't know, and this is a problem that you see in many areas. So there's things that you know that you don't know, right? So you know that maybe, okay, I can light a fire with a ferro rod, a fire steel. I can maybe do flint and steel. I know a few tinders.
But even those things are what I see people say, oh yeah, I can do that, and then when you actually see them do, no, they actually have no idea, but everyone thinks they.
Yeah, so they know it. They know a few, but then maybe they know that they haven't done bow drill yet, right? And they aspire to. So they know that they don't know bow drill, right? Or maybe they do know bow drill. They've done it. They've got a few embers with a few different pieces of wood, and they know that they haven't tried it with XYZ species, right? So there's some things that they know are on their tick list of things to improve on. So they know they don't know those things, right? But then there's a whole bunch of things, and this is where the Dunning-Kruger really comes in. There's a whole bunch of things about that subject matter as a whole that they probably don't even know that they don't know. They don't even know that that area of knowledge exists, right? Or they don't know that there's so much nuance and detail. They know some of the superficial detail, but they don't know there's a whole other level of knowledge to gain. They're not even cognizant or aware of the fact. And so it's not knowing what you don't know. So it's a combination of this being really confident based on the basic knowledge of going from 0 to relative hero, plus not knowing what's beyond that, puts them in this position of overconfidence. That's the thing. You get into a position of overconfidence, both in terms of applying the skills, and so this is something for everyone to be wary of. That and again, there's an old adage, isn't there? There's a little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing, and that is also really where this is coming from. That you've got to this first little peak, but it's a false peak. When you're going up a mountain and you think you got to the top, but you haven't. It's a false peak, and there's a whole other mountain still to climb. This is the same thing, and so there's this slightly negative derogatory term that gets used in the context of Dunning-Kruger, which is you've climbed to the top of Mount Stupid. So that's your kind of false. That's your false peak, right? You've got to the top. You think you're at the top. You think you've got a handle on the basics, but you don't know there's a lot more than the basics. You don't know what there isn't is beyond you, and also you're overconfident in what you do know because you haven't got the experience of applying it in lots of different contexts and maybe more difficult circumstances than the context in which you learnt that skill on a course or from your friend or just the locality that you've applied it in.
And of course, the more that you do know that you don't know, you know that you absolutely know nothing.
Yeah, and so exactly. So Gordon's absolutely right. So what you'll find with real experts is that they don't like being called experts because they know they've got a lot more to learn, and also that they're quite humble about what they know. So if you think about somebody like Morz Kahansky, he was quite a humble guy in many respects, and the amount of knowledge he held was huge. The amount of experience he had was huge. You see that with people like David Westcott as well, who are quite quiet and unassuming, and Cody as well. And they'll all admit that there's other things that there were things along the way that they had to learn that they didn't realise, that they didn't know until they came up against that brick wall or that learning point, or nature taught them a lesson. And then also where they are now, where they're regarded as experts by the wider public, they also know there's areas that they want to work on, that they want to learn about, and there's areas that they don't know about, and that that they stick to their knitting, so to speak. Like, this is the environment I know really well, this is the environment where I know how everything works, but other environments I'm not so confident in. And I think, but the beginner wouldn't necessarily be like that. The beginner would be, okay, I've learnt this thing in this place, in this context. Now I'm a survival expert. Now I'm a bushcraft expert because I've got this basic thing nailed in my locality. And that's a dangerous place to be, both in terms of your own personal ability to apply it and your own personal safety in the bush or in the wilderness, but also if you are then inclined to teach other people, you're teaching from the perspective or the place of relative inexperience, and that can be dangerous for people learning from that person as well.
Especially from a safety point of view.
Absolutely.
It's not just teaching a craft, you're teaching people life skills in the bush and safety, survival particularly.
Yeah,
and that's
and at the 2022 GBS, Cody put this very clearly, is that you are dealing with people's lives. In teaching these skills, you are dealing with people's lives. And some of the bushcraft instructors might think that they're not. Well, I'm not a survival instructor, I'm a bushcraft instructor. And of course we can a discussion for another day where the overlap between those things is. But if you're thinking, well, I'm just teaching people camping skills, sure, but if they do some of those things wrong, they can still get themselves into trouble. They can still cause bushfires, they can still cause themselves injuries if they're using cutting tools incorrectly, particularly if they're doing it away from help. There's lots of things that you can, if they're not applying them correctly, even if they're there out of choice. Survival situations tend to be people being there when it's not their choice and they want to get out of the bush. Bushcraft situations, if you want to term it that, tend to be people who choose to go to the bush or the wilderness and they want to be there for a trip or a camping period of camping, whether they're journeying or whether they're just sitting there and working out of a base camp, but they choose to be there and they choose to use the skills and they're not in any hurry to go home. That would be one distinction you could make. But even so, if you've chosen to go to the bush and you take an axe or a machete and you're lighting a fire and you're cooking on a fire, there's lots of things that can go wrong there. And if people haven't been taught the right way of applying those things safely, even when they're not close to help, if they cut themselves or what have you, then that can be quite serious. So, yeah.
It's, I feel, I suppose a lot of people now, as far as with YouTube, that's going down another rabbit hole, but say with YouTube, and people film a lot of them, their adventures, and that's a different thing. It's like, okay, this is my experience, and those things are fine. I'm not meaning to come across being like a or anything saying that. I'll probably have to edit that out. But
just do another version then.
So not meaning to sound elitist in any way, and that word expert, yes, I personally don't like that word, and I do see that at home. People will apply that to themselves, and of course an expert has stopped learning, because in my point of view, particularly from a martial arts perspective, there is no master, there is no expert, because you're always an eternal student. It's an attitude. Mm-hmm. But for a lot of people have a YouTube channel, and there's adventure YouTube, and that's all fine. You're filming your experience and your activities that you've done, and it's fine. I think that's wonderful. But it's when it comes to, say, which is going to lead down what we're going to talk about shortly, about, say, teaching and that type of thing. But when you're coming across as an authority about something, and you have very limited experience, and you don't know that, which is the whole point of what we're talking about, that can be a dangerous thing. And what I see, and particularly in Australia at the moment, is that a lot of people are going into the realm of not just adventure, but also instructional type things, and people are just having a go, if you know what I mean. Oh yeah, I'll just go and start this and start up a channel in this respect, without that sort of depth of knowledge, or and not even what I would term as a minimal amount. There is a minimal level of skill that if you're going to go down that route, it's particularly with teaching, and that's a whole another ball game, and teaching is a different ball game, and they're two separate things in my perspective. But I also see the same thing happen with even in the military, in my military experience. with instructors that have been teaching for a number of years that are still at the same level, have never learnt to learn anything new. And in that same, and I still think that applies. It's not just new people, and that's, I find that very frustrating, and it's one of the reasons I've been over here doing a course, because you never stop learning. And even this very thing we're talking about, I myself am guilty of that, from having what I thought was a basic level, and doing lots of courses everywhere, and then coming over here on one of your courses a few years and thinking, wow, I absolutely know absolutely nothing, and it's just eating humble pie, and it's a big thing. And even after this last course, I still feel like, wow, it's just it never stops, and I think that's a good thing, but it's just like getting a kick up the backside. I said, no, you just think, wow, it's. But I see that from a professional level, particularly in the military as well, for people that haven't bothered to learn from other people, but to go to learn something, to even learn how much they don't know, because all they've done is the same thing for 15, 20 years and never gone outside to see what else is happening. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point, and that ties in directly with the Dunning-Kruger stuff. So again, it's about knowing what you don't know. It's about resetting where you are on that scale, and getting off the top of Mount Stupid, where you think you're at the top of learning, whereas in fact you've got to come back down again in terms of confidence, and there's a lot more learning to be had, where ultimately your confidence will go back up again because you've got really solid knowledge. So you get to this sort of false peak of confidence where you're overconfident, and then later on, as you learn more, and you realize there's more to learn, and you realize there's more perspectives. So I was lucky in that my basic courses that I did many years ago, I did with Woodlaw, which is Ray Mears' school, and some of those courses were with Ray Mears himself back in the day when he was running a good number of the courses there, but he also had other people working there. So my first course was actually John Ryder. He was the course leader on the first proper bushcraft course that I did, and that was the year 2000, and he was running that course at Woodlaw. Now, he was one of the speakers that I invited to the GBS this year, and he's gone down some fantastic routes with Cybertracker and bringing that to the UK, and again raising the standard in lots of different areas in the UK bushcraft scene. And I was lucky enough to learn from him, and also when I was working at Woodlaw, I wasn't just learning from Ray Mears, I was learning from Juha Rankkonen, who is a Swedish guy who'd worked with Ray for many years and was very skillful. And in fact, I probably learnt as much from Juha as I learnt from Mears. And then also I was fortunate enough to go and work on winter courses. So I'd done the winter courses, and then I went and worked on the winter courses, and I worked alongside Lars Falk for quite a few years, running those courses in northern Sweden. And so I kind of came away with having had quite a few different inputs in terms of people's perspectives, but it was all within the flavour of Ray Mears' bushcraft school, as it were, and there's a certain ethos there. And without being negative, it's quite closed. It's quite a closed ecosystem outside of the people that are involved in it. And one of the things I realised, so I came out of that quite confident that I've got a good grounding from some really good people, right? To sort of as a platform for me then to build my own teaching career further on. I was teaching there full time for 5 years, and then I left to set up Frontier. But then I realised there were a lot of other people around who I wasn't aware of, and I didn't have contact with because I'd been in this kind of closed ecosystem of good people. But only learning from those, and then I realised there were many other people there that I could learn from, that I could also gain from spending time with and rubbing shoulders with. And so I, in my own way, was also guilty of coming out thinking, well, I've learned from Ray Mears, I've learned from Juha Rankkonen, I've learned from John Ryder, I've learned from Lars Falk. I've got a pretty good bunch of mentors there and instructors, but there was still more to learn from other people. And I think so we all need to be aware of that limitation of thinking that we know as much as we need to know. There is quite likely people and experiences outside of what you've already got that will further enhance your skill set and your knowledge base. So.
Okay, that's probably a great place to segue into what I also wanted to talk about, and talking about who should teach bushcraft or survival, because they are crossover subject matters, subject areas. And I look at there's two different things. There's a skill set, which requires a massive amount of training and study over a long period of time with all the different areas of bushcraft and survival that go into those subject areas. Just, having the skill set just to do those competently, or at least to a minimal standard. And then there's the subject of teaching, and having been trained as a teacher and music teacher and in pedagogy and all of those things, not one-on-one teaching trumpet for years and years, and as well as teaching classroom music. There's a whole amount of training you need to do that, as well as you develop ways of being able to teach. So I take teaching as quite a personal thing, being able to facilitate learning from a student and identify with each student, and being able to pass something on. If something doesn't work, you need to open another door to find a way to get that information across. And that's something that takes a long time. Some people do it naturally, and it's also about knowing your subject matter back to front. But having the ability to teach is a completely separate thing. Mm-hmm. So in terms of teaching bushcraft and survival, what I'm seeing today in Australia being a few years behind, which I actually think is a good thing, because we're just going through like a renaissance just behind everyone else. But I think it's important, as far as that safety aspect, that people are teaching, that have at least a minimal amount of skill. And I see there's some things springing up where there's people having a go, which, as I said, from an adventure and showing what they're doing is fine. But when it comes down to teaching a subject, I think that's a different thing. And because there is no award that's recognised for bushcraft or survival type training. Probably a similar thing exists in the military. Once you've done certain, your subject 1 for corporals, 2 for sergeant, etc. All those things, there's teaching qualifications that you have to do, that you can deliver a lesson safely, and a whole stack of other things. That exists there, but in the civilian world of bushcraft and survival, it doesn't.
No, there's no recognised bushcraft instructional award. There's certainly no globally recognised bushcraft award. There are some schemes here in the UK, one of which was started by John Ryder, who I've already mentioned. So he was originally working with a college and had some certified instructional programs there for people who wanted to be instructors, ranging from relatively short to quite long extended courses, which he still runs through his woodcraft school. But they're still, while they're validated by an external examining body who validates various vocational training schemes in different areas of industry and work, they're not it's not an NGB award in the same way as a mountain leader award is. There's a central NGB, or the canoeing coaching and instructional and leadership awards in the UK. There is a central governing body that ratifies and issues those awards. So
we have the equivalent in Australia for a lot of the adventure training type.
Yeah. So even within individual geographies and territories and countries, there isn't a standardised bushcraft instructional award, and that's in some ways a good thing, but in other ways a bad thing. It's a good thing in the sense that people have to stand up on their own reputation, rather than just going, I've got a piece of paper, I jumped through these hoops, and now I'm an instructor. It's your ability to survive as an instructor as an ongoing business and earn your living from it is dependent upon you having a good reputation. And if you're a bad instructor, or you teach people bad things, or useless skills or ineffectual skills, then over time people will find out about that and you'll go out of business probably. So it's a good thing from that perspective, but as Gordon's suggested, it also does allow anybody, you know, my mum could set up a bushcraft school next week and start teaching bushcraft if she wanted to, even though she's got no experience, and that's kind of the problem that we're trying to talk around here. And while it's good that there's no elitism in that sense, it is also potentially dangerous for students, particularly beginning students who don't necessarily know how to navigate the terrain of established schools versus less established schools. Many people can easily make a shiny website these days, and that's, you know, that makes it difficult for people to differentiate between long established schools and maybe people who are new to the subject.
If people even read it.
If people even read the detail, yeah. So that's kind of part of the issue that the industry here in the UK, and then I use the word industry in a loose sense, the industry here in the UK has had to face for 20 years, and I think one that you're starting to have to address in Australia as well.
Yeah, that's something I think we're facing, that issue in Australia with, as I said, which is sort of Dunning-Kruger in the teaching side. As they've done a little bit, it's fine as saying whether you call yourself, and you've done one course and you call yourself an expert, that doesn't give you the right to just start teaching. It's,
no, and we had that. I mean, I remember when I was course director at Woodlaw at Ray Mears' school, and I was ultimately awarded an instructor's knife by Ray Mears. So I guess, you know, I don't know if there's an equivalent, but it's like being handed your black belt by Ray in a sense. It's like, yeah, you're now an instructor, and not many people have been given those antler-handled knives over the years. A few other people that I know, like James Bath, who works with me, he was made an instructor a couple of years after I was. Dan Hume, who I hired at Woodlaw, who was very good and worked up through the ranks, as it were, and got a lot of experience there. He was made an instructor. Before me, there were a few people like John Ryder and Juha Rankinen, and so not many people have been handed that. And that took, in my case, it took about 5 years to get to that level of, and that was a lot of working on courses and teaching, as well as, you know, having done courses, assisting on courses, and then running courses. You know, as an aspirant instructor, at some point you have enough experience to be awarded, and it was a long apprenticeship with high standards. But then we also had people coming to do courses as a student. They do a 1-week fundamental course, and then you'd see that they were teaching either under their own auspices or, you know, somewhere else under some, like, I don't know, at a campground or as part of scouting or something, and they'd say they were trained by Ray Mears. Now, they'd done a course at Ray Mears' school that taught basic skills, and they weren't even taught by Ray himself, and yet you had people using that and said trained at Ray Mears' school or trained by Ray Mears. That's very different to doing a 5-year apprenticeship where you're working full-time teaching bushcraft, doing a 6-day course that's aimed at beginners. And that's a problem that we still have an issue with in the UK. People thinking that's enough to justify why they can then teach. They could barely do the skills themselves. They'd just been introduced to them. They were keen, which is great, but now they're setting themselves up as an instructor based on that one thing, which I think is dangerous, frankly.
It is, and it's an integrity issue too.
Yeah.
Well, whether that will, if it's not Dunning-Kruger, it has to be an integrity issue, because you either, you know, mounts you don't know.
Yeah. You either don't know. You either don't know that there's a lot more to learn, or you do know and you don't care. Yeah.
No, exactly.
Yeah.
And there, I think both sides of it, and I think it's we're starting to see that in Australia, and of course the general, but they don't know that, and as things become more popular, people want to do a course, and if they don't read that, I think people should be looking at the credentials of the people, see what their background is, what they have, and yes, you can make a piece of paper and a website say anything, and if you're falsifying your credentials, well then you're
Well,
an idiot.
that's fraud.
Just fraud.
That's fraud. Yeah.
But but you need to look up the experience. How long have people been doing things? I know as a studies a 4-year degree doing education to be able to teach in a school. So there are certain, and that's no guarantee of a good or bad teacher either. That's also experience, but there is a minimal level of training to be a teacher. And these subjects, the topics of safety, you're teaching people how to do things in the woods safely, build shelters. How do you do that safely? The different ways of watershed, fire, or all the things, safety, signalling, navigation particularly. You might have the skills in your head and be able to do it, but if I see it in the military, lots of great skills and knowledge, but there are people that can't teach their way out of a paper bag for some of it. So it's being able to, and I don't mean to be negative in saying that. That's just an observation. That happens everywhere, not just everywhere I've noticed that. So teaching ability is really important for that.
Yeah, I mean, I think teaching navigation and tracking are two of the harder things to teach, because you can't see what's going on in the person's head. Like if I'm teaching you bow drill, I can physically see what you are and aren't doing with that bow drill set or how you've made it. If you're navigating, yes, I can see what you're doing with a map and compass or what have you, but still, how are you translating that information? It's going on in your brain and I can't see what's going on in your brain. And if we're learning to track and you're following a trail, I can see what I can see in terms of the sign that's on the ground, but I can't see inside your mind's eye to see what you're seeing, what you can and can't see. So you need to be a very good teacher to be able to teach those skills. More so, teaching is a skill in itself. And there are many different aspects to it, as Gordon's alluded to. It's a profession in itself, it's a skill in itself, and a lot of people who go from being an enthusiastic proponent of a subject or an enthusiastic practitioner of a subject to teaching it don't make that crossing with any teaching skills. And again, that can be problematic. You can learn some of those things as you go, but having some background in teaching from someone who, even if it's just observing other people teach and having reflective practice in yourself. So
good and bad.
Yeah, absolutely. Watching how people get things across, watching how students respond to it, and then starting to integrate some of that if you have the opportunity to, if you're giving lessons with, if you're working with somebody else and you're starting to give lessons, you could start to include their methodologies in what you do, see how the students respond to that. Then you have to be reflective. Is there something I could have done better or differently? Could I have helped that person who was struggling in a different way? And then reflect back into your own practice and how you deliver that the next time, and then how you problem solve for students. And it takes time. I never had any formal training in teaching, but I did go up through the ranks and the belts of a jiu-jitsu organization that actually had formalized instructor training classes. So not only did you observe the instructors, you also then went to a weekend where you were going through how to teach. You weren't just what to teach, you were going through how do I teach things, how do I teach certain things safely so that people don't get injured, how do I get things across, different ways of demonstrating things, whether you're just doing it entirely without saying any words or whether you're explaining things, how you break things down, how you keep the pace of a session up, how you can change the pace, have people coming in and going out or working on things for longer, and just really thinking about what you're doing. And that was done at 3 different levels, as a kind of junior, sort of just assistant instructor, at a kind of almost a club instructor level, and then at a high level. And you had to go through, as well as going through all the other things you needed to do to get certain belts, you had to have gone through these. You had to have gone through these training camps to get to the next level, so that you actually, when you ended up as a brown belt or a black belt, you actually had some teaching skills when you got there as well. You weren't just a good practitioner, but then you were thrown into teaching sessions and had no experience of teaching or any theory behind it. So that was really useful for me.
I remember the Australian Society of Jiu-Jitsu has had the same thing when I used to train. I'd like to say I haven't been able to train as much as I'd like in the last few years with Larry Papadopoulos' school. Fantastic training, but exactly the same. That same. I'm not sure how how common that is today. But I also can identify with what you're saying about not being able to see skills as not classroom but one-on-one trumpet playing, other than teaching people how to read music and the sort of the mathematical side of reading notation. Violin and other skills like relating to bow drill, you can physically see those skills. But trumpet or any wind instrument, most of what's happening here with the embouchure, with your air column, your airflow, aperture, all of those things are inside. You can't see them, so you have to make assessments and judgments just purely on sound, which I suppose once you can identify, it's like seeing colours, and that's really hard to be able to hear what's going on without being able to see and what's in the person's head and all those things. Like an academic thing, it's an oral thing, and it's a physical thing altogether, and creative. But and that takes time, and it's a complete, and that's it's experience at the end of the day,
it is.
and trying to get all those things together. And so I think how would you say, so there's a minimum level of skill that people have to have. Teaching can be developed, but you have to know when you're ready to teach, and how does someone know when they're at a certain level, which I suppose comes down to integrity, when they're at that level to teach. Is there a minimum skill set, and what would that be?
There's a couple of different elements to that. I would say at the survival end, you need to be extremely careful, because you're absolutely dealing with life and death situations. By definition, if someone's in a survival situation, they are either going to be dead at the end of it, or they're going to be alive at the end of it. And your job in terms of teaching survival skills is to make the likelihood of them being alive at the end of it greater. And that's a huge responsibility. That's something that Cody talked a lot about at the GBS, and he actually talked about that being a sacred thing, that your integrity is totally, you cannot do that without 100% integrity, and you absolutely have to be focused on teaching correct information that's tested, that has been tested in the context that you're teaching for. Otherwise you're just bullshitting people. And you cannot bullshit people where you're dealing with life or death situations. So that's at the very hard survival end of the spectrum, and I think unless you're able to deliver material that has been tested in real world situations and that you're teaching it in the correct context, you shouldn't be teaching it at all. It's as simple as that. You shouldn't just have read Lofty Wiseman's survival handbook and then be keen on survival skills and start teaching survival courses. You're going to potentially cause more harm than good.
And that is happening.
The other thing I would say in as a general point, before I talk more about the bushcraft side of things, is that unless your motivation is really about developing the students' abilities, you shouldn't be teaching either. If it's about your own ego, oh look at me, I'm an instructor, or raising your own profile, or just narcissistically strutting your stuff in front of students, you should not be a teacher. You should go and do something else, full stop. Your primary aim should be the development of the students. The students are why you are there as an instructor. You're there to enable them to be more capable, to be more knowledgeable, to be more confident, and to be able to do the things that they want to be able to do in the outdoors. That's your role as an instructor. It's not about you. And if it's anything to do with you, you shouldn't be doing the job.
As a classroom, like it with them, within the education system, and yes, there are holes I believe in our education system. There's lots of things we should be teaching, but that's another rabbit hole. That is about the students' development completely. But when you start adding in with today's world, with the social media and YouTube and everything like that, there's this different coloration of everything, where that sort of solo egotistical pursuit takes over, because now we've got a subject that is not just about people's learning. It's about something that, say, looks cool. I'm telling you, we've got all the survival related programs, entertainment based programs, and people see those. Oh, that looks cool, so I'll go and do that. Oh, I'd like to teach that. And but that doesn't happen with maths, English, geography, and all traditional subjects in that way.
So there's a couple of things there. when I was talking about being an instructor there and saying, you know, your goal should be students, I'm thinking very much about what we've just done this last week, or what you've done with, you know, it's an in-person, in the field course. But yes, we have this whole thing with material being available online, and I have online courses, but then we have YouTube as well. And I think one of the things that people who are producing YouTube content need to be clear about in their own mind, and again, this is something that I talked about in my 2019 GBS presentation, which is available online for free if you want to dig that out. Maybe Gordon could link to it. But one of the things I talked about was the YouTube end of the spectrum, because you can be educational on YouTube. You can make videos on YouTube with the aim of educating people and helping them with their journey, and that's totally valid. And actually, a lot of the material that I've put on YouTube, certainly in the early days of me putting material on YouTube, that was my aim. It was sort of putting a simple lesson online for people to benefit from. But you've also got people who've grown up watching Ray Mears and Bear Grylls and other survival shows, and a lot of those, like Ray Mears was definitely aiming to be educational largely. Later on it started to be a bit more sort of documentary, but certainly the early shows were kind of like lessons but on TV, which was great. But TV's moved away from that now. There isn't much TV that's made like that anymore. Particularly even within public service broadcasting, there isn't a lot of TV like that. Everything's entertainment, and so we've got to disentangle what's education and what's entertainment. And then you've got people going to make YouTube videos who are replicating elements of that. And then you've got people who love the subject, they're really super keen, they're really enthusiastic about bushcraft or bush tucker or whatever it is, and they want to make videos because it's an expression of their enthusiasm for the subject, but they're not clear in their own mind about how are they doing that, you know. And if they're using a model which they've seen from other people that's about educating, and then they're making a video out of their own enthusiasm about a subject that's also following that same model, i.e. educational, they don't necessarily have the background, the depth of knowledge or the breadth of knowledge to back that up. And that's unintentionally where you get misinformation being put across, or incomplete information, or superficial information, or information that's been learned in a narrow context that you can't apply to a wide context, being put across as definitive in YouTube channel and YouTube videos. And that's not done intentionally on their part to mislead, but again, it's back to being on that kind of Mount Stupid, you know, that top of the Dunning-Kruger curve, where they're not quite aware of the nuances around the subject matter, and they're presenting things in a way that's maybe a little bit more cut and dried than it should be. But that's not done out of any sort of malice, or it's just I'm enthusiastic, I want to share this, but then the only model they've got for sharing is education. And you alluded to it earlier, and it's something that I talked about in 2019 as well. There's this whole other way that you can make video content, and that's just documenting what you're up to. You can be a complete numpty and be like, I don't know how to do bow drill, but I'm going to learn. And I've done bow drill with willow, but I've never done it with alder, and I've never done it with pine, and I'm going to make a series of videos of me trying to learn, and what are the differences, and what changes do I need to make when I go from one material to another. And that can be thoroughly entertaining to watch, and it can actually also be educational, because people are picking up on the problems and the faults that you're being honest about having, and you're not putting yourself out there as an expert either. And that's a totally honest way as a beginner or an intermediate that you can share your love for the subject and it be useful and entertaining to other people without you misleading people intentionally or unintentionally about that you're an authority. But the problem is, because that's a newer format, if you like, not so many people do it because they've watched things like Ray Mears or Les Hiddens where it's quite authoritative. People think that's the only way that you can make a video, and it isn't. You can vlog is a good word. You can video blog your experience. You just have to be humble enough for people to see you making mistakes. And then of course you can make videos about trips. Like I did my solo trip on the Berens River, for example, and there were high points to that and there were low points to that, but I wasn't telling people that's how they should navigate and approach that river. I was just documenting my journey on that river on my own in the Canadian wilderness. That's also very valid in terms of, you know, a format, because I'm not setting out to teach people this is how you should approach this river. This is my experience of doing this. You can judge it how you want, and there's no reason why people can't make content like that. And I would encourage particularly new people who are really enthusiastic about learning the skills but want to video it, to do it in that way rather than trying to teach people online.
There's actually a really good example of that with a guy in Australia who has a YouTube channel that does exactly that. A really great channel, Scotty's Gone Walkabouts, where he doesn't profess to be an expert or anything like that, and he's showing he's completely honest with integrity, showing his adventure, and he's not trying to be an authority on anything. He's just showing and completely honest about his mistakes. He's got a great channel, and it's actually doing a lot for bushcraft, and I think that's wonderful. So there are a few people doing that, so it is a great channel to check out as well. It's very honest, and he's a very humble guy, and he's actually come to do one of our courses as well. And he's really keen to learn, but he's doing it in the right way, and I think that's fantastic.
Yeah, so you mentioned a couple of things there. You mentioned honesty, and you also mentioned humility, and I think those are both things that, especially people who want to move towards teaching, they need to have. They need to be honest with their potential client base, obviously, but they also need to be honest with themselves about where they're at, and that's about a certain amount of self-awareness versus the backdrop of where they're at with their own skills, their own knowledge, and what they could be learning going forward. So again, having an awareness of where they're at on that learning spectrum and not falling into some of those traps of the Dunning-Kruger effect that we talked about, and humility. You know, you're always going to learn more if you've got humility. If you're egotistical and you think you know everything, you're not open to learning from either your own experience or the experience of other people. And I think that's an important thing as well, to have that humility to know where you're at. Everybody knows something that you don't. You know, that's an old Japanese proverb, and you can learn something from everyone. You know, I learn a lot from watching my students. They sometimes come to a problem without preconceived ideas of how to do things, and I learn stuff from that. And you get all manner of different people. You get trained ecologists and trained botanists. You get people who've worked in different areas, or gardeners who've got interesting knowledge about particular plants, or people who've worked in horticulture, or people who've worked in forestry, and all manner of different fields that are interested in bushcraft, but come on course and you have interesting conversations, and you learn from that.
Wonderful. I had a physician and a law professor in my team, and it was and a tree surgeon.
Yes,
it's like, what was a wonderful, and every course is like that. So that was like a wonderful skill set, and every group had their own. Yeah, that's fantastic.
Yes, yeah. And that's great, but I think the thing that people need to be aware of, though, is where the limitations of their knowledge is. And someone said to me a while ago, and it's a funny analogy, especially when you put yourself out there online, you get all manner of people making comments, even though it's not their area of expertise. And so there is this fine line. Yes, you can learn something from everybody, and yes, everyone knows something that you don't, but the question is whether or not it's relevant. And do you know who Professor Brian Cox is? You know, the guy who's made a lot of he's a physics professor, astrophysics professor, but he's also made a lot of very popular TV shows about space and all manner of things. And we live in this world where there's been this sort of democratization of knowledge. Everyone can get online, everyone can make their opinion known, but the problem is not everyone's opinion. You know, you get these people who say, oh yeah, well, you know, my opinions, you know, I have an opinion and you have an opinion, but frankly, without sounding too much of, again, not sounding elitist, but in certain areas not everyone's opinion is equally valid, because they have less experience. And so the good analogy that someone mentioned to me a while ago, which I really like, is when we put ourselves out there online, you know, we're trying to share information, whether it's in a Facebook post or whether it's on a YouTube video or it's a blog post or it's you're writing a guest article for a big website or what have you that's like a magazine. You'll inevitably have people who have opinions on that, and there are people who are other experts in outdoors who are really experienced. They're either professional educators or they're really experienced just practitioners in the outdoors. They live their life outdoors, and they will have comments on that, and they're the ones I take notice of. And then you've got the guy, no disrespect to accountancy, but you've got the guy who's an accountant who goes camping a couple of times a year, who's maybe done a couple of bushcraft courses, who has an opinion about what I've written. And where I'm interested in their opinion is whether or not that information is useful to them where they're at. I'm less interested in their opinion about my level of knowledge because they don't have the experience. In the same way as if I wanted help with the accountancy of my firm, I would defer to their greater level of experience and knowledge in that area. You don't get people, and the funny thing is, within bushcraft and survival in particular, we seem to be prone to everybody thinking that they've got a valid opinion, even though they maybe only touch the subject in a very light way, compared, say, to Gordon, who's involved in teaching in the military, teaching in the Air Force, teaching civilians, who spends a lot of his time out in the bush and has a lot of experience. And then you've got someone who is a barista in Melbourne who likes to go camping occasionally, who thinks that their opinion is as valid as Gordon's, and it isn't. And it's something that we have particularly an issue with social media around bushcraft and survival. I think because there's a lot of entertainment, you know, you've got Alone and Naked and Afraid and all of these things that people are consuming, they feel like they have an opinion that's valid. In the same way, you know, you get some guy with a beer gut who likes a tinny, who thinks that they know how to manage their favourite footy team better than the guy who's managing the footy team. There's just this tendency to be on the outside of something and somehow think that you know better, and you've got to be very wary of some of the comments in YouTube, particularly the critical ones from that perspective. And so going back to this analogy that someone mentioned to me, you don't often get, say, a plumber with a plumbing channel trying to share useful hints and tips for, you know, making sure your sink doesn't leak, or making sure, you know, preventative measures in your home to make sure you don't have a pipe leak or what have you, based on years of experience. You don't then have an accountant or someone who works in an abattoir or someone who runs you know, a software company having opinions about plumbing in the YouTube comments. And yet that's what we face day after day, is that you've got, you know, frankly inexperienced or ignorant people thinking that they have a valid opinion about the information that we're sharing. It's a frustration, and but the thing is, beyond that, you also get people with a little bit of knowledge then wanting to teach, and that's going back to what we're talking about. That's quite a dangerous thing. You need to have an awareness of where your experience and knowledge level sits versus the wider universe of people who've been doing this for a long time. Doesn't mean to say that fresh blood can't bring new energy and new perspectives and new experience to the subject matter, but you have to be honest with yourself about where you sit in that overall landscape of people who've been doing it for a long time.
I suppose on a safety perspective, looking at, say, first aid, you're not going to have someone that's just done, you know, a couple of simple first aid courses show complex surgery because they're just, you know, or how to suture a wound because they're just having a go, and say this is how I reckon you do it, and that doesn't happen. You don't see why, because people know that there's a definite line of skill, safety you need to have, but in a different way, in exactly the same way, but a different skill set, but an equally valid one, is that doesn't happen in the bushcraft and survival world, because it's okay to think, oh, I'll have a go at that, but that could be a navigational error or something to do with fire or any other thing that could start a bushfire, or just doing something correctly that might have a very dangerous consequence if not done correctly. But it's okay, just, oh yeah, that's all right, that's fine, as long as it looks good, it's entertaining. You don't see that. Someone it probably has, not much more than how to put a band-aid on or do things showing,
true.
complex. So that's the same sort of thing, but you don't see people making YouTube videos about that unless it's someone that's has a medical background, or paramedics or military people that have all that background training showing different ways of doing things, because it's coming from a position of experience and authority, and are qualified to do those things.
And those things are often very heavily caveated that this is a circumstance under which you would do this. Other times you wouldn't do that. This is an extreme thing, or this is an emergency technique where you don't have enough equipment. It's very delineated as to when you might apply that. And so and experts generally, people on my Ask Paul Kirtley's, they complain that I talk too much, but often what I'm trying to couch is the circumstances and the nuances of things. And so you get the beginners who want simple answers, and that's part of the issue, is that there's not always simple answers. People ask about edibility of certain plants, and some plants are edible all the time in any quantity. That's fine. Other things are totally poisonous. You don't want to consume them at all at any time of the year in any quantity. But there's a whole grey area in the middle of certain toxins interacting with other things, certain plants being toxic at certain times of the year and not others, certain things not being good if you're starving but fine as a balanced part of a diet that's high in other nutrients. And it's complicated and it's nuanced, and there aren't simple answers, and yet we live in an age where people want simple answers to things. You just look at political campaigns, whether it's in Oz, the UK, the US, Canada, the arguments around things should be complicated, they should be nuanced, there should be detail. The world we live in is complicated, and yet a lot of political campaigns are really, really simplified to the point of being moronic. Because that seems to appeal to the wider lack of debate that we seem to have, or just people want black and white answers, and nature doesn't work like that, and then we need to be aware of that. So going back to your question of who should teach, we talked about survival, we talked about teaching online, and I think at the bushcraft end, I think it depends what level you want to be teaching at. Look, if you want to run an afternoon for kids where they do a bit of fire lighting, cook some marshmallows over the fire, maybe do a little bit of whittling, then you don't need to be massively experienced in wilderness bush travel to be able to do that, to give the young kids a really good experience. What you need to be good at is doing those things safely. And there are schemes around that, like we have the forest schools scheme here in the UK. They're becoming
popular in Australia as well.
Fantastic. And that's really good for teachers or forest school specialists to be able to work within a framework and be ratified as safe to run really nice sessions for kids that get them interacting with natural materials in the outdoors, and I think that's fantastic. Scouting also has an established structure of ratifying people for running activities outdoors, and I think they're really, really valid. Again, you don't need to be someone who spent months of the year in the northern forest hunting and living in a cabin and self-sufficiency to be able to teach scouts how to light fires and make campcraft cooking rigs and things. But just be aware of where you're at. If you stray from what you know and start teaching people about contexts or areas that you have no experience of, then you're on thin ice, I think, at that point. And so I think it goes back to self-awareness and honesty, of being honest with yourself about what do I know, what's my core competency, what have I been trained in, what were my mentors experienced in and competent in, what have they passed on to me, what's my experience, and what can I safely and competently share with my students. And it doesn't have to be all areas. Bushcraft is a broad church, as a whole. There's so much within it. And one of the problems that I have, and I'm sure Gordon has, is that because we're teaching certain things with competence, students sometimes assume that we're knowledgeable or experts in other areas. And I've said this before, I've done a bit of flint knapping, for example, but people think because I'm teaching friction fire techniques and foraging and tracking and navigation and various other things that I'm also an expert in flint knapping. I'm not. I don't teach flint knapping. If people want to learn flint knapping, I'd say go to Will Lord, or go to Teresa Camper, or somebody who's spent a long time looking either specifically at flint knapping or looking at primitive skills in a little bit more detail than I have. And I think knowing your limitations, yeah. So even if you're teaching at a high level in one area, you might not be teaching in another area at all, or you might be teaching at a lower level, but understanding where you're at on those spectrums is really important.
But it's assumed you're an expert at all of them for some reason.
Yeah. So it's down to you to be honest with other people and yourself about where you're at. And like I say, you can be relatively inexperienced and be running an afternoon session for kids with some basic fire lighting and a little bit of campfire cookery, or maybe a little bit of den building. You don't need to be a wilderness expeditioner to do that, but if you're teaching people wilderness expedition skills, you should have some experience in those areas and have gone and applied those in context, not just practice those skills in your backyard.
So minimal skills to the level you're teaching at. Don't teach above your skill level, and don't bullshit people.
Don't bullshit people, absolutely, yeah. And context is really important. If you haven't tried things in a particular context and you are teaching them for that context, you need to be questioning whether or not you're in a position to really teach that subject properly. So,
listen, talking about in my other hat as a professional trumpet player, not that I'm doing it as much as I used to, but being a trained musician and in an industry, and I hate the word industry, of being entertainment, there's got different calibers, just like medical, you've got different calibers of musician, from people that trained from reading musicians to people that, in different genres, and, simple music to really complex stuff. But everyone has an opinion of music. Everyone has their own opinion, and yet you're talking about what's good and bad. And of course, it's subjective. And I know that a lot of musicians and other fellow trained musicians, it's always very frustrating, because you've got a lot of, with a lot of sort of an academic background to, play art, music, jazz, classical, all sorts of, which is a completely different level. But and even that can be subjective. It's said there's different complexities to different sorts of music. But everyone has an opinion. Oh, that's a good tune. Oh, that's great. And so, okay, why is it great? And of course, you've got people different, and that's very frustrating talking about music in particular. So it's probably not the best thing to pinpoint, but I know exactly that frustration. And so generally I don't talk about it, but it's coming from the people that don't have any knowledge about that whatsoever, but yet they have an opinion when you might have studied and played for years and years and years, and people don't know those intricacies. And it's music, because you can't physically see it, and a lot of it is training with your ears to be able to do that. And that's something that I've grappled with for years, and it's just I just don't get involved talking about that, but I fully understand that there's a lot of other musicians
to me there's a difference between enjoying a piece of music, I don't know, listening to some, I don't know, John Coltrane or some I don't know, Dizzy Gillespie or something, and enjoying the piece of music just as a piece of music, as a person listening to the music. There's a difference between that, and that's valid for, someone can listen to that and go, I really dig that, I really enjoy that, that really resonates with me, just without even understanding what's going on. And it's perfectly valid to say that. It's also perfectly valid to say, I don't like that.
That sounds like scrambled eggs.
It just doesn't do it for me. I prefer Tchaikovsky or Beethoven or whatever. It's just like, that's valid, and that's subjective. But there's a difference between that and saying, oh yeah, he shouldn't have played it like that. I didn't like the way he played. I didn't like the way he was playing that. Or he should have played it like this. Particularly when you don't play the instrument yourself, or you're a beginner in the instrument. And I think it's that difference that we're talking about. You can watch a show like Alone and enjoy the experience of watching it as a piece of entertainment. But there are far fewer people than would get entertainment from watching those shows that are in a position to comment on whether or not the people who are in those shows made the right decisions or not. And it's that we're talking about. It's like, where are you at in terms of being able to make opinions in an informed way on a subject matter, and then also where are you at in that continuum in being able to share those skills if you have some with other people? And that's very different to just watching someone and enjoying or not enjoying what they're doing, right? So
yeah, and then I suppose and then where the popularity of something and likes being the credibility and authority. Okay, once you achieve a certain amount of likes, that now gives me the authority to start teaching something. And then people are judged, rather than say, oh yeah, you're the person that does this. You've got this YouTube channel. But personally, I'd rather be known for having a good school with good teaching, not because of how many likes you have on a YouTube channel, which to me happens. Okay, I run this, but I so happen to have a YouTube channel or something else. That should be secondary toward to what the primary thing is, which is a good school that's with experience, teaching something that's solid, reputable, and safe.
Yeah, most of the big YouTube channels that are in the bushcraft and survival field are not run and filmed by people who have good quality field course schools, and they may not even have a field course school at all. And in fact, most field course teachers don't have the time to be filming lots either. That's the thing. And there are some crossovers there. There are some people who have reputable or successful field course schools who've also got a decent profile on YouTube or Facebook or what have you, and there are some crossovers there, but mostly there's a separation. You've got, if you think of a lot of people who are established and have authority in certain areas, they don't have YouTube channels, and partly it's age. I was thinking about it again recently, and some of it's age. It's like if you think about Dave Westcott, Dave Holliday, Morse Kahansky, who's unfortunately no longer with us, Lars Falt, some of the people who were the elders in this subject matter, Tom Lutyens, retired US Air Force survival instructor, a lot of these elders, they gained their spurs, as it were, and their experience of teaching, as well as their experience of the subject matter, long before YouTube was even a thing. And then you've got the young people who, YouTube only really came about in the last 15 years, right? It's certainly not even 15 years old yet. The iPhone, I think, is about 15 years old as we record this. You've got younger people who've come up knowing YouTube and wanting to make YouTube. So you tend to have the kind of younger people who are coming up making the YouTube videos who aren't necessarily established teachers, and you've got the established teachers who either don't need to or don't want to make YouTube content, and so you've got this separation as well of the authorities over here, and they've probably written multiple books, they've probably been teaching in the field or university outdoor ed programs or extended education programs for youth at risk, and all of these things that they've been doing for years and years and years, and yet you've probably never heard of them. And then you've got this modern world of social media and YouTube over here with the guys who are in their 20s, 30s, maybe coming into their 40s, who have an established YouTube channel sharing what they're up to, but the two don't often cross over and meet in the middle. And that's the other thing. So the most accessible perception of the subject matter is here with the YouTube stuff, and yet maybe more of the authority is over here with some of the guys who've been doing it for much longer but don't have a presence on YouTube, either out of choice or just because it's passed them by. It's like my parents, right? My dad's 78, my mum's 78. The people in their 60s and 70s aren't necessarily going to suddenly start YouTube channels. My parents struggled just getting email and websites to load and doing their banking online and things, which they didn't have to do for most of their lives. Yeah, which you didn't have to do for most of your life, right? And now we have to do that. And why are people suddenly going to start making YouTube videos if they don't have to, or they don't want to, or they've been operating in a certain way for years and years and years? So there's that as well. So even if you enjoy watching YouTube videos about bushcraft and survival, certainly look beyond that, as Gordo said at the beginning. Look into some of those people that we mentioned at the beginning, and also there are some great books out there, and I'm constantly amazed.
What I was going to say, Dave Westcott in his talk, which is brilliant. And he mentioned, like, we all should be, as educators within the bushcraft and survival world, you need to be familiar with. There's certain texts that are fundamental that you need to know back to front, and you should know who those people are. And anyone that's teaching needs to know those things. And really, it's a bit dodgy if you don't. You should.
Yeah, I agree. And I've had number of conversations with Dave Westcott over the years about that subject and around that subject. And one of the things that he pointed out to me a while ago, and I think it's very valid, is that other outdoor subjects, outdoor activities, and in particular things like climbing, rock climbing, trad climbing, alpinism, mountaineering, they celebrate their literature. There are classics in their literature. There's classic accounts of climbs, classic accounts of expeditions, classic accounts of whole movements, like and biographies of people who were really important in developing the sport and developing the activity, that are held up as things that all people who are serious about those subjects should read. We don't do the same in bushcraft and survival, and we should. There's classic literature there that people should know, going back to things like Richard Graves' bushcraft books, Morse Kahansky's Northern Bushcraft, all of the woodcraft movement, so Nessmuck and Ernest Thompson Seton and Bernard S. Mason, and all of those books people should know. There's a whole raft of classic literature where a lot of the material that's being put on YouTube these days comes from. Some of those people that are putting it on YouTube don't even know that it comes from there, because they've learnt it fourth hand from someone else. And there's a Chinese
from watching another YouTube
channel. And or from watching a TV show where somebody's doing it, not always well. Some of these TV shows, they've got survival or bushcraft consultants that sit behind the camera. You never see them in front of the camera, and the presenter is showing something or using something in a situation that they were only just taught by the consultants earlier in the week or just before the filming, and they're not doing it particularly well, and yet someone's, a million people have watched that, and a few people have replicated it, and then they're like, oh, I'm going to show that on a YouTube channel, but they're copying something that's a bad copy. It's a bit like when you went back, back in the day when you used to copy your mate's music on cassettes. And if you've got a bad copy,
I still have a cassette player,
well, there you go, but if you've got a bad copy, and then you take even a good copy, like a high quality tape, and take a copy of that bad copy,
Chinese whispers,
it's still a copy of something that's not a very good replication of where it started. And I think going back to the original sources is an important thing to do, as a self-check of making sure that you're not subject to Chinese whispers as well. I think that's important. And also crediting where things come from. There's a lot of, one of the reasons we end up in this situation of not knowing where things come from is because people don't credit it. And that's, there are some quite well-known TV personalities who've had established bushcraft and survival shows who've also added to that. I can watch some of those shows and they're talking about something, and I'm like, I know the book that they're talking about. I know the book that's come from. They're telling a story, and I'm like, I've read that book, but they're not crediting that information back to that book. And maybe there's a TV reason why that happens. Maybe it's to do with not advertising products and things like that, and books are products. But equally, saying where things come from when you can. Scientists do it all the time. If you write a scientific paper and you are drawing on other people's scientific research, or even just drawing on anthropological research or what have you, you have a list of citations and you cite it in your paper. So all of the first principal information that paper is built on, you can go back to. And we should be doing a bit more of that, I think, giving just people credit.
Writing essays at school or at uni, always credit bibliography, what your sources were. And
so this Chinese whispers thing is an issue, and I know one of the other things you wanted to talk about was edibility tests, because that's something that where I see Chinese whispers at play.